He had ridden that fence line 100 times. Same trail, same cold, same empty Montana morning. But on this particular October day, something was different. There was a wagon in the ditch, one wheel gone, the horse cut loose and vanished, and the canvas tied from the inside. Not from the outside, from the inside. He sat on his horse and listened to the silence. And the silence was wrong in a way he could not name. When he finally opened that canvas, he did not find what he expected. He found a woman burning with fever, a little boy holding an empty canteen, a teenage girl with a knife pointed at his face, and a handwritten note that said, simply, "His name is Vane, and he is the man who killed me." Eli Rourke had spent 9 years learning how to need no one. He was about to unlearn every bit of it. This channel is where the wide-open West comes alive, stories of dusty trails and quiet courage, of cowboys who carry more than a saddle, of mothers who hold their families together with bleeding hands, of strangers who become family when the road runs out. If you believe that love is a choice and that the most powerful stories are the ones that could happen to anyone, you are exactly where you belong. This story will remind you that running towards something and running away from something can look identical from the outside, and that the bravest thing a person can do is stop long enough to find out which one they are doing. Stay with it. There is a moment in this story that will stay with you long after it ends. If this kind of story matters to you, leave a comment below and tell us why. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. And hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to this little corner of the West.
The morning Eli Rourke found them, the sky was the color of old iron. He had been up since before 4, same as always. Coffee on the stove, boots by the door, the kind of routine that stops being a choice after enough years and just becomes the shape of a life. He saddled Grudge in the dark, which was fine. He knew every buckle by feel. The horse knew every trail by memory. Together, they moved out into the October cold, like two things that had learned to exist without needing much from the world. The west fence line ran about 3 miles from the main house, following the creek bed down through a draw and back up along the ridge. There had been a storm the night before. Not the worst he had seen, but mean enough. Wind like something personal. He needed to check for damage before the day got away from him. He found 3 posts down near the creek crossing. He made note of it. He kept riding. It was the drainage ditch off the old county road that stopped him. He saw the wagon first. It had gone over on its side, pitched into the ditch at an angle that said the front wheel had gone first. One wheel was snapped clean off at the hub. The canvas tarp covering the bed was still mostly in place, pulled tight and tied from underneath. Eli pulled Grudge to a stop. He sat there on the horse and looked at the wagon for a long moment without moving. The draft horse that should have been hitched to it was gone. The traces had been cut. Not snapped under pressure, not worn through. Cut. Someone had taken a blade to them and walked the animal away, and the canvas was tied from the inside. He had lived alone on this land for 9 years. In that time, he had learned to read silence the way other men read words. The silence around that wagon was wrong. It was the silence of something, trying very hard to make no sound at all. He dismounted, slowly, tied Grudge to the fence post, walked toward the wagon with his hands visible and his pace easy. The way you approach an animal you are not sure of. He stopped about 4 feet away. "Anybody in there?" he said. Not loud, not soft, just a voice, nothing. He waited. Then he said it again. There was a shift of weight inside the wagon. Small, careful, like whoever was in there had moved just enough to hear better and then caught themselves doing it. Eli reached out and untied the nearest corner of the canvas. He pulled it back slow and looked inside. The woman was lying in the back of the wagon bed, unconscious. She was on her side, one arm stretched out, the other tucked under her body. Her hair was dark and matted on the left side. where something had bled and dried. Her skin was the color of wax. She was breathing. He could see that from where he stood. But the breathing was shallow and quick, and the fever smell was already in the air. In the crook of her body, pressed against her like he had been there all night and intended to stay, was a boy, 8 years old, maybe, dark eyes wide open, looking straight at Eli without a single word. In his hands was an empty canteen. The boy was not crying. That was the thing that got to Eli right away. Children cried. Children that age, in a situation like this, they cried. The fact that this one was not crying meant he had already used up whatever crying he had. Then movement in the far corner of the wagon caught Eli's eye. A girl, 16, he would guess. She had pressed herself into the angle where the side wall met the front board, and she was holding a folding knife pointed at his face. The blade was maybe 3 inches, not enough to do real damage to a man his size, but her hand was not shaking, and her eyes were not either. She was evaluating him, the way you evaluate a threat, not a rescuer. Eli raised both hands, slow and open. "I'm not going to hurt anybody," he said. "I'm just the man who owns the fence line you're parked against." The girl did not lower the knife. He looked back at the woman, looked at the boy, looked at the sky. The clouds coming in from the northwest were the flat, heavy kind, riding low and gray-purple at the bottom. He had seen that sky 100 times. He knew what it meant. He made a decision. "Here's what I'm going to do," he said, talking to all 3 of them, the girl with the knife included. "I'm going to pick up your mother and carry her to my house. It's about a 1/4 mile up that track. She needs a warm room, and she probably needs a doctor, and neither of those things are out here." He paused. "You 2 can follow, or you can stay. But it's going to snow before noon, and it's going to snow hard, and that wagon is not going to keep the 3 of you warm through it." The girl held the knife steady, but her eyes moved to her mother, then back to Eli, then to her brother. The boy looked at Eli and said very quietly, "Her name is Maggie." Eli nodded. "All right." When he lifted Maggie out of the wagon, she stirred, but did not come fully awake. He felt the heat of her through his jacket. She murmured something, a word or a name, too low to make out. Her body had the particular weight of a person who has stopped holding themselves up. He carried her up the track toward the house. The boy walked beside him without being asked. The girl followed about 10 feet behind, and she kept the knife in her hand the whole way. He got Maggie inside and laid her down on the couch in the front room. He built the fire up, and he put the kettle on. He found clean cloth and water, and he cleaned the wound on the side of her head, which was a laceration about 2 inches long, already beginning to close on its own. Not deep enough to need stitches, deep enough to have bled considerably. The girl stood in the middle of the room and watched everything he did. The boy sat down on the floor beside his mother's couch and stayed there. Eli had just straightened up when something fell. He turned and saw it on the floor near the door, dropped from the bag the boy had been holding. A single piece of paper. He picked it up. It was a civil court summons, Cook County, Illinois. The name at the top was Margaret Callahan. The charge was an unpaid civil debt of $14,200. The required appearance date was 12 days past. Below the summons, folded once, was a plain envelope. He opened it. The handwriting inside was a man's. It was rushed and uneven. Letters, leaning into each other like the hand writing them, had been shaking hard. It said, "If anyone finds this, please believe her. His name is Vane. He is not a creditor. He is the man who killed me." Eli read it twice. He folded it. He put it in his shirt pocket. Then he turned and looked at the girl with the knife. "What's your name?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Nora." "And his name?" "Tommy." Eli walked to the window and looked out. The first flakes were already falling, light and scattered, but they would not stay that way. He turned back to Nora. "There's a bedroom at the end of the hall with 2 beds. You and Tommy can take that room. It has a lock on the door." He paused. "I'm going to make soup. Your mother is going to need something warm when she comes around." Nora stared at him. "What do you want?" she said. "In exchange for not calling the sheriff." Eli looked at her directly. He understood why she had asked that. He did not take it personally. "I don't want anything from you," he said, "but I need your mother to tell me the truth when she can talk. Not because I'm curious, because that snow out there is going to close the road out of here for at least 2 weeks. And if the man who wrote that note is right, then whoever killed him is going to be looking for her." Nora said nothing. He went to the kitchen and started the soup. Maggie came around fully about 2 hours later. He heard her voice, low and careful, asking for the kids. He heard Tommy answer. He gave her a few minutes before he came in. She was sitting up, holding a glass of water Nora had given her. The color had not fully come back to her face, but her eyes were clear. She looked at him the way a person looks when they are rapidly processing information and not sure yet what they are deciding. She said, "What do you want?" In exchange for not calling the law. He had already heard that question once from Nora. He was beginning to understand it was not rudeness. It was the language of someone who had learned that everything costs something. He put the summons and the handwritten note on the table in front of her. Then he sat down and said exactly what he had said to Nora. Maggie read the note. She already knew what was in it. She had read it 50 times in the weeks, since James had sealed it in that envelope and pressed it into her hands. But she read it again now anyway. Then she looked up at Eli. Outside, the snow was coming down in earnest. It moved in wide sheets past the window, thick and silent and steady. The road that ran from the house out to the county highway was already disappearing under it. He watched her look at it. For a second, something moved across her face that he did not expect. It was not fear. It was not relief exactly. It was something more complicated than either of those things. Something like a person who has been running for a very long time and has just been handed a reason they did not ask for to stop. 1 second. Then it was gone, and her face was composed again. "I can't pay you," she said. "I don't have any money. I didn't ask for money." "Then what are you asking for?" he said. "I'm not asking for anything yet. Get warm. Eat something. When you're ready to talk, we'll talk." Tommy, from the floor beside the couch, said quietly, "Thank you, mister." Eli looked at the boy. "You're welcome." That was the first day. The snow fell for 18 hours. By the time it stopped, the track from the house to the county road was buried under 22 inches and still drifting in the draws. The temperature dropped to 12 below at night. The sky after the storm was a specific shade of blue that only exists in high country Montana in October. The kind of blue that is beautiful and has no mercy in it. They were not going anywhere. The morning after the storm, Eli sat down with Maggie at the kitchen table. She was upright and steady, a bandage above her left ear. She had slept, which had helped. Her color was better. Her eyes were the same, though, clear and careful and not giving anything away. He put the arrangement on the table, plainly. No paper, no signatures. Paper left a trail, and both of them understood that without needing to say it. He told her they could stay in the converted outbuilding behind the main house. It had a wood stove, 2 real beds, a door that locked. In exchange, she would help with meals. Nora and Tommy would take on chores around the barn, whatever was in their range. No questions about the past. No questions about where they were headed when the road opened. Just do the work that was in front of them. And then he said the thing he had been thinking about since the night before. He said, "The outbuilding locks from the inside. The key is yours, not mine." Maggie looked at him when he said that. He meant it as a practical statement. She heard it as something else. By the way, the set of her shoulders changed, just slightly, like something had been put down that she had been carrying without noticing. She said, "All right, no bargaining. No gratitude that went on too long. Just all right, the way a person agrees to something when the terms are fair." Nora was standing at the far end of the kitchen. She had been there the whole time, listening. Now she looked at Eli directly and said, "If you hurt my mother or my brother, I'll burn your barn down." Eli nodded, seriously, like she had added a reasonable clause to an agreement. That nod did something. He could see it in Maggie's face. Whatever reassurance he might have offered in words would not have done what that nod did. Tommy was sitting at the table, eating oatmeal. He said, "Does your horse have a name?" Eli said, "His name is Grudge." Tommy set down his spoon. "Why would you name a horse Grudge?" Eli thought about it for a moment, then said, "I named him when I was angry." Tommy considered this with the full seriousness of an 8-year-old. Then he nodded and said, "That makes sense." That was the first real thing Tommy said to him. The first thing that was just a conversation. Nothing underneath it. Nothing on guard. Eli thought about it later, riding out to the west fence to start repairs. He could not say exactly why it stayed with him. The first 3 days were careful. Everybody moved around the house and barn like people who had not yet learned where the edges were. Nora watched everything. Tommy asked questions about the animals. Maggie worked without being asked and without talking more than the task required. On the morning of day 3, Eli came out to the barn at 5 in the morning and found her already there. She was struggling with the tie-off on the milk cow, trying to get positioned to hand milk, clearly doing it for the first time. She knew the general idea. She did not know the specific mechanics. He watched for a moment. Then he came over, and without saying anything, he guided her hands into the right position. They worked side by side in the dark and the cold, their breath coming out white in the barn air. No conversation. The work was enough. At some point, Maggie noticed the name on the small board above the stall. She said, "Her name is Margaret," Eli said. "Yes," and looked at the cow instead of at her. She did not ask anything more, but he felt her take that in. By day 5, he had started letting Tommy come along on fence repairs. The boy was not much help with the physical work, but he talked the entire time. And Eli found that he did not mind it the way he expected to. Tommy talked about his school in Chicago, about his friends, about his father, in the specific, unsentimental way that children talked about parents, mixing the good and the bad in the same breath without knowing it. "Dad forgot to pick me up a lot," Tommy said one afternoon, working at pliers on a wire end. "But when he remembered, he always brought ice cream." Eli was silent for a moment. Then he crouched down to the boy's eye level and said, "A good father is one who keeps trying to remember, even when he doesn't always manage it." Tommy looked at him and nodded, like that was the correct answer to a question he had been sitting with for a while. Eli stood back up and kept working. He did not say what he was thinking, which was that he had not spoken those words to anyone. He had not even quite formed them for himself in 9 years of thinking about the child he never got to father. They had come out of his mouth like something that had been waiting behind a closed door. On the evening of day 7, he came in to fix a section of pipe under the kitchen sink that had frozen. Maggie was at the table kneading bread dough. Not because she was a natural cook, he had already figured out, but because her hands needed to do something while her head was working. The bread was the outlet. The smell hit him when he came through the door. He stopped. 9 years since that smell had been in this house. His wife had made bread the same way, at the same late hour, for the same reason. He stood in the doorway for long enough that Maggie noticed and looked up. He went in, sat down at the table. She put a piece of the bread in front of him without asking. He ate it. She sat across from him. Neither of them said anything for a while. The fire made a low sound in the stove. Outside, the snow had a blue-dark quality through the window. It was the first meal they had shared at the same table. There was nothing romantic about it. It was just two tired people, and warm bread, and a moment of not having to explain themselves. Day 10 brought the hardest scene yet. Nora exploded at Maggie in the outbuilding, loud enough that the words came through the thin walls. Eli was crossing the yard, and he heard most of it. She told her mother that everything was her fault, that she should have left sooner, that they were living like charity cases off a stranger. Her voice had the particular edge of a teenager whose fear had nowhere else to go. He stopped walking. He heard Maggie's voice after a moment. "Quieter, steady," she said. "You're right about leaving sooner. You're completely right about that." A long silence. Then Nora, not knowing what to do with being agreed with. Eli stood in the yard and waited until it was quiet. Then he went on to the barn and let them have the space. That was all he could give them right then. Space and silence, and the pretense that he had not heard. That night, he sat alone in the front room and looked at the fire for a while. He thought about what it meant to hold a family together from the inside when the outside had gone wrong. He thought about doing that alone, which Maggie had clearly been doing for a long time. He was beginning to understand something about her. He was not yet sure he wanted to understand it. Understanding people created obligations. He had managed for 9 years by keeping his obligations to the land and the animals and nothing else. But understanding was happening whether he wanted it to or not. The milk cow went down on day 12. Eli noticed it at the late feeding. Margaret was standing differently. Weight shifted wrong, head hanging lower than it should. He checked her temperature, found it dropping, felt the hardness in the affected quarter that he had been dreading since she had seemed off 2 days before. Acute mastitis pushing towards serious. He sent Tommy to bed and settled in for a night in the barn. There was nothing dramatic about it. It was just what needed doing. He had been there about an hour, lantern lit, working through what he could manage without a vet, when the barn door opened and Maggie came in. She was wearing his spare coat over her own, too big across the shoulders. She had a small kit with her, the kind that nurses apparently carried, even when they were refugees in a stolen wagon. She said, "I'm a nurse. The physiology isn't that different. You need a second pair of hands." He looked at her for a moment. Then he moved over to give her room. They worked through the night, not dramatically, with the slow, tired competence of two people who knew how to do difficult things and had stopped needing to make noise about it. She knew what she was doing, more than he expected, more than a basic understanding. Around 2 in the morning, when they had done everything they could do and were waiting to see how it would take, they sat down against the far wall of the stall. The lantern was between them. Margaret was breathing easier, which was a good sign, or at least a better sign than before. Eli said, without planning to, "She was born the year my wife died. Margaret, I kept her because she needed keeping, and I needed something that needed me." Maggie was quiet. Then she said, "That's not a strange reason to keep an animal. I know. I just never said it out loud before." She looked at him briefly, then looked back at the cow. After a while, he said, "You know more about cows than you let on." She almost smiled. "I grew up on my grandfather's farm in Iowa. Moved to the city when I was 16. Then I married James, and I just stayed in the city because that was the life we were building." She paused. "I've been standing in this barn for 2 weeks and breathing actual air for the first time in longer than I want to admit." It was the first time she had said anything about what she wanted. Not what she was afraid of, not what she was running from. What she wanted. What she missed. He did not say anything in response, because there was nothing useful to say, and he had learned long ago that silence received a confidence better than words did. They stayed like that, neither of them sleeping, both of them keeping watch, while the lantern burned, and the night got colder, and the cow breathed slowly in the straw. Just before 4 in the morning, the barn door opened again. Tommy stood there in his socks and his coat pulled over his pajamas. He looked at the two of them. He said, "Is she okay?" Eli said, "She's going to be all right." Tommy came in and sat beside his mother for a few minutes. Then, apparently satisfied, he got up and went back to the house. He paused at the door and looked at Eli and said, "Can you teach me to ride? Like actually ride, not just walk around?" Eli said, "Yes." Tommy nodded and left, watched the door close behind him. She said quietly, "He hasn't asked anyone for anything since James died." Eli did not say anything, but he thought about that sentence for the rest of the night. Margaret pulled through. By morning, her temperature was coming back up, and she was eating, which was the sign he needed. He told Maggie at breakfast, and she nodded with a satisfaction that he recognized. The satisfaction of a person who had done a hard thing and done it well. That week, something shifted, not dramatically. The way shifts happen in Montana, slowly and without announcement. The way the light changes between seasons, without you being able to name the exact day it changed. Tommy began following Eli everywhere it was allowed. He learned the routine of the barn with the specific intensity of a boy who had found something to be interested in. He asked about everything: what the horses ate, why you checked the fence, what happened to the calves in winter. He had 100 questions, and he wanted real answers, not kid answers. And Eli gave him real answers, and the boy filed them away and asked more. Nora remained cautious, but she began helping without being asked. She would arrive at the barn in the mornings and take up tasks that needed doing, silently and efficiently. She was strong, and she was not afraid of cold or dirt or early hours. She had her mother's way of working, Eli noticed. No performance, just the job. On a Tuesday afternoon, working the north fence line together, Nora was quiet for a long stretch. Then, still looking at the wire she was threading, she said, "Did you ever have kids?" Eli said, "Yes, they didn't make it." Nora was still for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry," he said. "Thank you." 2 words, no more than that. But she looked at him differently after that, and they both knew it. Maggie, he was learning, had a particular way of showing up. She did not announce herself. She did not ask for help, and she did not explain herself. She simply appeared where the work was and did her share of it. He had known plenty of people in his life who worked hard. He had not known many who worked with her particular quality of quiet, which was not emptiness. It was the quiet of someone thinking constantly and choosing carefully what to say. One evening, he found her in the barn, looking at a shelf of old tack. She was holding a small leather repair kit that had been his wife's, turning it over in her hands, not knowing what it was. "Leather repair," he said from the door. She set it down carefully. "Sorry. I was just looking." "You don't need to be sorry." She looked at him. Then she looked at the shelf. "I keep doing that," she said, apologizing for existing in a space. He did not know how to respond to that. So he said, "Most of this stuff hasn't been touched in years. If it's useful to you, use it." She nodded, slowly, like she was filing that permission in the same place she filed everything else that surprised her. Here. He went to bed that night, thinking about what it would take to unlearn the habit of apologizing for existing. He thought it was probably not a short process. He thought it was probably the kind of thing that happened one moment at a time, in barns and kitchens, over days and weeks, with no ceremony to it at all. Day 14. The snow was breaking. Eli rode into Millhaven on a Thursday morning. 12 miles on horseback, which was manageable. The road still too drifted for the truck on most of it, but passable on the high spots. He needed grain, he needed wire, and he needed to know if anyone had been asking questions in town. He was back by 3 in the afternoon with supplies and a local paper from the rack outside the general store. Ruth Elder was at the house when he got back. She had come over through the back path, which she could do in most weather conditions, because she had lived on that land for 40 years and knew every step of it. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and Maggie was across from her, and Tommy was somewhere outside, and the two women were talking in the way that women who are just becoming acquainted sometimes do, careful and curious, and covering more ground than the words suggested. Ruth looked at Eli when he came in and said, "I was beginning to think you'd gone to town and kept going." He set the paper on the table. "Pick this up." Maggie looked at the paper, at his face. Then at the paper again. He opened it to page 4, column on the right side, 4 sentences. Most people would not even slow down on it. He watched her read it. The item said that a man from Illinois was making inquiries in the Billings area and surrounding counties about a woman and 2 children reported missing. The name given was Margaret Callahan. Anyone with information was asked to contact a number that Eli suspected would lead back to a law office, not a sheriff's department. Maggie set the paper down and said nothing for a moment. Ruth looked at the paper, then at Maggie, then at Eli. She said, "I'll freshen my coffee," and got up and went to the stove and became very interested in the kettle. Eli sat down. He said, "Tell me about Vane." And Maggie told him. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Her husband, James, had built a construction business in Chicago over 15 years. Hector Vane had come in as a financial partner 8 years into it, and everything had looked clean on the surface for a long time. Then James started finding things that didn't add up. Money moving in ways that construction money did not move. Payments to contractors that did not exist. Invoices for materials that were never delivered. He spent 6 months quietly documenting it. He was preparing to go to federal investigators. He told Maggie what he had found the night before a meeting he had scheduled with a lawyer who specialized in exactly this kind of case. The next morning, James drove to that meeting. He never arrived. The investigators said a deer had come out of a tree line on a two-lane road, and James had swerved into the guardrail. The barrier gave way. The car went 40 feet down an embankment. 7 days after the funeral, Vane appeared at Maggie's door with a stack of paperwork and 2 lawyers and an expression of careful sympathy. He said that James, in the course of their business dealings, had accrued a personal debt of $14,200 that he had not disclosed to his wife. He said he hated to bring this up at such a painful time. She knew the debt did not exist. She knew it the way she knew everything James had managed to tell her in the 20 minutes they had on the phone the night before he died. But she had no proof, no money, 2 children to keep safe, and a man who had spent years learning to use the law the way a skilled carpenter uses tools with precision and without apparent effort. So she ran. When she finished, Eli said, "Do you have anything on him?" She reached into the cloth bag that never left her body, and she took out the USB drive. James sent it to me the night before he died. I've never opened it anywhere because I've been afraid of being traced. Eli looked at the drive. Then he looked at her. Then he said, "I know a man in Millhaven. Runs a computer repair shop. Known him 20 years. He can open it without leaving a footprint." Maggie's hand closed around the drive. She looked at it. He watched her make the calculation. The same one she had been making about everything since she arrived. Weigh the risk. Weigh the alternative. Weigh the person offering. She held it out to him. He took it, and he went back to Millhaven that same afternoon. What was on the drive was more than accounting records. There were internal emails that detailed the structure of the financial scheme in plain language. There were sets of invoices layered under shell company names, tracing money back through several businesses to a final destination that was not a business at all. And there was an audio file. The audio file was a recorded phone conversation between Vane and a man whose title, based on context, was a municipal official in the Chicago area. Vane's voice in the recording was relaxed and clear. He said, among other things, that the Callahan situation would be handled before it became a problem. He used that phrase, handled. Eli drove back to the ranch with printed copies of everything in a folder under the seat. He put the folder on the kitchen table when he got home. Maggie sat down and went through it page by page. She was methodical and quiet. When she finished, she put her hands flat on the table and said, "I knew those would be in there," Eli said. "You knew what was on it. James told me over the phone that last night. We had 20 minutes. I didn't have anything to write with. I just listened and held on to everything I could." He looked at her. He said, "What were you planning to do with it?" "Before the wagon broke down," she said. "Get to Denver. There's a lawyer there. Someone James trusted. Someone he said to contact if anything happened. I had the name and a phone number memorized." She paused. "I just hadn't been able to stop long enough to make the call." Eli sat back in his chair. He was thinking about what she had said before that. About 20 minutes on the phone. About listening and holding on to everything she could. He was thinking about the kind of person who could receive that kind of information in that kind of moment and retain it with enough precision to be useful months later. He said, "What did you do before you were a nurse?" Maggie looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite surprise. More like the expression of someone who has been asked a question they had forgotten was ask able. I studied forensic criminology, she said, at DePaul, 2 years. Then I got pregnant with Nora and I left the program. The silence after that had a weight to it, she said. James was the only person I ever told, and he never really asked about it after the first time. It was just something I had done before the life we built. Eli said, "That's exactly the skill set you need to write a credible forensic report on the injuries in the accident report," she said, quietly. I know. That's what James was counting on. He looked at her for a long time. He was revising something in his mind. He had been building a picture of her since the day he found her in that wagon, and the picture kept turning out to be more complicated than the previous version. He said, "I'll take you through what's on these pages tonight. You tell me what you can document from memory. We build the case from what you know and what's on the drive." Maggie said, "And then what?" he said. "And then we figure out who to give it to." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Why are you doing this?" He thought about it honestly. Then he said, "Because the right thing and the easy thing haven't been the same for me in a long time. And I've gotten tired of always doing the easy one." Ruth Elder had been living in the high country for 40 years, and in that time she had learned something that most people spend their whole lives missing. She had learned that the most important things never announced themselves. They arrived the way weather arrived. You looked up one day and the light was different, and you could not say exactly when it had changed. You only knew that it had. She had seen it happening since the first day she walked through Eli's door and found the dark-haired woman at the table and the boy out in the yard talking to the horses. She had not said anything then. It was not the time. But she had seen it clearly, the way old women see things clearly, when they have stopped caring about being right and started caring about being useful. She had Tommy over one afternoon when his mother was helping Eli with the winter preparation work. Tommy sat at her table and ate the ginger cookies she kept in a tin by the window, and she asked him about Chicago, about school, about his father. He answered everything directly with the matter-of-fact honesty of a child who had not yet learned to be evasive. He said, "Do you think my mom is okay?" Ruth said, "I think your mother is one of the toughest people I have ever met, and I have met some tough people in 40 years out here." Tommy said, "She cries at night sometimes. She thinks we don't hear, but we do." Ruth said, "That's how you know someone is carrying something real. Tough people cry, too. They just usually do it at night." Tommy thought about this. Then he said, "What about Eli? Is he okay?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Ellie has been in a long winter. I think the thaw is starting, but the thaw is slow." Tommy nodded like that made perfect sense. The next Thursday, Ruth found Eli alone in the equipment barn after supper, going through a harness repair he had been putting off. She sat down on a hay bale and watched him work for a while. Then she said, "Which scares you more, that she stays or that she goes?" Eli did not look up from the buckle he was working. He did not answer. Ruth nodded. "That's your answer," she said. He kept working. After a minute, he said, "She's dealing with something serious. This isn't the time." "I didn't say a word about time," Ruth said. "I said which scares you more. I'm not suggesting you do anything about it. I'm just suggesting you know the truth about yourself." He looked up then. She held his eyes for a moment, then smiled slightly and said, "I'll let you get on with that buckle." She walked home before dark. The following week, on a cold, bright Tuesday, Nora worked the north fence with Eli, while Maggie and Tommy were inside with Ruth, who had brought a recipe for a winter stew that she claimed could not be written down and had to be taught in person. Nora and Eli worked well together. She had her mother's instinct for silence around someone she was still deciding about. She did not force conversation. She handled the wire with competence, and she kept up with him without complaint, which was not nothing at 15 degrees in an October wind. They worked for about 2 hours before she said anything that was not about the work. Then, not looking at him, she said, "Did you ever have kids?" He said yes. They didn't make it. She looked at him then. She said, "I'm sorry. I really am." He said, "Thank you." They went back to the wire. After another half hour, she said, still not looking up, "My dad wasn't perfect." I know people think you're supposed to be sad about someone who wasn't perfect, but also be mad at them, and I don't know how to do both at the same time. Eli thought about that. Then he said, "You don't have to do them at the same time. You can do them separately. Take as long as you need on each one." Nora looked at him. Then she looked away. He did not know if that helped. He hoped it did. He was not an expert on grief. He was not an expert on anything except the particular kind of long, slow grief that came from being left by people who did not mean to go. That evening, when Eli came back in from the last barn check, he found Maggie at the kitchen table with a notepad and a pen, writing quickly. She had the printed pages from the drive in front of her, and she was working through them in sequence, cross-referencing with something she was writing from memory. She looked up when he came in. She said, "I think I can document 4 specific injuries from the accident photos that are inconsistent with the described collision. The angle of the primary head trauma doesn't match a forward impact at the speed they recorded." He poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her. "How sure are you?" "I'm sure enough to put it in writing and sign my name to it." He looked at the notepad. Her handwriting was precise and small, the kind that came from years of writing clinical notes in confined spaces. He said, "I want to set up a call with the Denver attorney, the one James told you about." "Can you do that?" She said, "Yes, I memorized the number." "When?" She said, "When I'm ready." He looked at her. He said, "Maggie." She looked up. He said, "You don't have to do this alone anymore." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she looked back at the notepad. She said, "I know. I'm getting there." He let that be enough. 3 days later, a call came from his contact in Billings. A man from Illinois, well-dressed, traveling with 2 other men, had been asking at the motels and the gas stations about ranches north and east of town. He had a description of the property. He had Eli's name. Eli hung up the phone and went to find Maggie. She was in the yard, hanging laundry in the cold, which she did because the line was there and the work needed doing even when it was 20 degrees. He told her plainly, and without building up to it. Someone fitting Vane's description was in the Billings area. He knew where they were. He could be here in 3 to 5 days. Maggie stopped with a pillowcase in her hands. She stood very still for a moment, looking at the line. Then she said, "I'm not running again." He had expected fear, or calculation, or a request to think it through. What he got was certainty. Quiet and flat and unmoving as the ground under his feet, he said, "All right." She went back to hanging the laundry. He stood there for a moment watching her, and he thought about what it meant to make a decision like that, what it required, what you had to have already lost before you could stop caring about losing more. He went inside and started thinking about what to do next. Day 21 and the work of preparation had a different quality to it now. They were not just living. They were building something. A legal strategy, piece by piece, the way you built a fence. One post at a time. Test it before you move to the next one. Make sure the ground holds. Maggie had memorized the name and number of the Denver attorney through 14 months of carrying it like something fragile. James had trusted this man. That was the extent of the endorsement, and she had decided it was enough. She had not yet made the call. She was not ready. She was close. In the meantime, the days had their own rhythm. Eli had taught Tommy enough about riding that the boy could handle Grudge at a walk, without assistance. And the look on his face during those lessons was the most uncomplicated joy that had been in this yard in a long time. Nora had started getting up at the same hour as Eli and Maggie without being asked, and she moved through the morning chores with a quiet efficiency that reminded him, more than anything else about her, of the woman who had raised her. One evening, around day 21, Eli came through the kitchen after the last barn check and found Maggie alone at the table. She was writing. He would understand later what she was writing. The forensic report, the document that translated what she remembered from that last phone call with James, what she had carried in her mind and body for over a year, into the precise clinical language that could stand up in a legal proceeding. She had her back to the door when he came in. He could see her shoulders. He had spent enough weeks watching her that he could read her the way you read weather. The set of her back right now was not the set of concentration. It was the set of endurance. Someone doing a hard thing and not stopping, but feeling the weight of it with every word. He did not announce himself. He put the kettle on, made coffee, set a mug on the table to her right without interrupting her. Then he sat down at the far end of the table. She kept writing. He waited. After several minutes, she set the pen down and put her hands flat on the table. She did not look up, she said quietly, talking to the notepad or to the air in front of her. I feel guilty that I didn't grieve right. When he died, I was angry, then scared. Then I had to move. I never had the space to just be sad about it. Eli said, grief doesn't come with the right schedule, and it doesn't have to look like crying. She looked up. It was the first time in the scene that she looked at him directly. The lantern light made the lines of her face clear, and the tiredness in her eyes visible, and also something else. Something that was not tiredness, something older and more stubborn. He put his hand over hers on the table, not gripping, not holding, just resting his hand over hers for one still moment. Then he took it back and stood up. He went to check the stove. Neither of them said anything. He heard a small sound from the staircase later, and when he glanced over, he saw Tommy standing in the dark halfway down, in his pajamas. Still. The boy had come down for water and stopped. He stood there, looking at the kitchen, at the two of them, at the ordinary domestic scene of two people at a table with coffee and lamplight. Then he turned and went back upstairs without the water. The next morning at breakfast, before Eli had finished his first cup of coffee, Tommy sat down across from him and said, "Can we do a longer ride today? Like actually out to the ridge?" Eli looked at him. "Yes," he said, "we can do that." Tommy nodded and ate his oatmeal with the satisfied expression of someone who had made a good decision. Maggie watched this exchange from the stove. Her back was turned, but Eli could see her face in profile, and she was almost smiling. Not quite, but the almost was there. He rode out to the ridge with Tommy that afternoon. They went slowly. The boy was a natural. It turned out, in the particular way that certain children were naturals with animals, which was less about technique and more about the absence of fear. He sat easy. He communicated with his weight without knowing he was doing it. At the top of the ridge, they stopped and looked out at the valley below. The ranch was a cluster of structures far down in the draw. Smoke from the chimney, the outbuilding, the barn, Tommy said. It's big, Eli said. Eli? Yes, Tommy said. Do you get lonely out here? Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I did, for a long time. Tommy looked at him. Do you still? Eli looked at the valley, at the smoke from the chimney. Less than I did, he said. They rode back down in the late afternoon light. That evening, Nora brought firewood in without being asked and stacked it by the stove. She was leaving to go back to the outbuilding when she paused at the door and said, without turning around, Ellie, he said. Yeah, she said. Thank you for not making us feel like a burden, he said. You're not. She went out. He sat with that for a while. The fire settled. The house was quiet in the way it was sometimes quiet now, which was different from the quiet it had been before. Before, the quiet had been absence. Now it was just the ordinary quiet of people at rest, in the same place. He was not sure when that had changed. He knew that it had. Vane arrived on the afternoon of day 25. Eli heard the vehicle from the barn, an SUV, dark-colored, coming up the track at a deliberate pace. He came out and stood in the yard and watched it stop in front of the house. 4 people got out. Vane was the one Eli recognized from the description Maggie had given, though he had built his own image of the man from her words, and the image was accurate. Hector Vane was 55 or so. Well-built, expensive coat, the kind of grooming that spoke of money, old enough to be invisible. He carried a folder. Behind him were 2 men and a woman in a suit who was clearly the attorney. Vane looked at Eli. He said, I'm looking for Margaret Callahan. I believe she may be a guest of yours. Eli said, You have paperwork? Vane held out the folder. Eli took it and read through the top pages. It was a civil court order, valid, signed by a judge in Cook County, requiring Margaret Callahan to appear within 10 days to resolve estate and debt matters following the death of James Callahan. The filing looked correct. The signatures were real. Eli handed it back. Then he stepped aside and let them in. Maggie was in the kitchen. She had heard the vehicle. She was standing at the window, her back straight, her face composed. Tommy and Nora were in the outbuilding. Eli watched Vane walk into the kitchen and look at Maggie. He watched the smile. It was not a cruel smile, and it was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a person looking at the expected result of a chess move they had planned well in advance. Maggie said nothing. Vane sat down and put the paperwork on the table. He spoke in the measured, reasonable tone of a man who never needed to raise his voice because his voice never needed to be raised. He said he was sorry it had come to this. He said he had no interest in making her situation more difficult. He said all she needed to do was appear in court within 10 days and submit to the legal process, and the matter would be resolved with minimal disruption to her life going forward. He said he had known they were here for 5 days. He had waited to come in person until he had the proper documentation, because he wanted to do things correctly. I don't need to break the law, Maggie, he said. I just need to use it better than you do. While he was talking, Eli became aware of something. He did not hear the back door of the outbuilding. He did not hear anything from outside. But the absence of Tommy's voice, which he had come to know as a constant ambient sound in the yard, was a sudden wrong silence. He looked at the window, nothing visible. One of Vane's men was no longer in the room. Eli moved to the back door and opened it. Tommy was running across the yard toward the barn, running hard, the way a child runs when they know what they are running from. He disappeared through the barn door. Good. Good instinct. The man who had left the room was coming back through the outbuilding door, and Nora was in front of him. She was not harmed. She was walking ahead of him, and her face was white, and her hands were at her sides, and she was not speaking. Eli had lived long enough to recognize what was happening and to understand that there was one correct response to it and several incorrect ones. He went back inside. He walked to the cabinet. He took down the bottle of whiskey. He poured 4 glasses and set them on the table, calmly, like a man setting up a regular evening. Then he looked at Vane and said, "You're on my property with a court order that permits you to speak with Mrs. Callahan. It does not permit you to use her children as leverage. You have 10 minutes to have a drink and go. After 10 minutes, your paperwork doesn't carry much weight out here." Vane looked at him with an expression of patient amusement. "Is that a threat, Rourke?" Eli said. "That's 10 minutes." A silence. Then Vane looked at Nora, who had come to stand beside her mother without anyone telling her to. He looked at Maggie. He looked around the kitchen. He looked at Eli. He picked up the folder and stood up. 10 days, Maggie, he said. If you're not in Chicago, I come back with an emergency custody motion. The grounds being that the children's mother is financially unstable and emotionally unfit to provide a stable home environment. He said it without inflection, the way you recite a fact. My lawyers are very good at building that case. I'd prefer not to have to. He left. His people followed. The SUV went back down the track, and the sound of it faded into the afternoon. Nora sat down on the floor where she was standing. She sat cross-legged on the kitchen floor and put her face in her hands. Maggie went and sat beside her on the floor and put her arms around her. Eli went out to get Tommy from the barn. The boy was in the corner stall, sitting in the straw with Grudge's nose pushed against his shoulder. When Eli came in, he looked up with an expression that was trying very hard to be brave. Eli sat down in the straw next to him. He did not say everything was fine. It was not fine, he said. You did exactly right. You got out. That was the smart thing. Tommy said, "Is Mom okay?" Eli said, "Your mother is more okay than most people I have ever known." They sat in the straw for a few minutes. Then they went back to the house. That night, after Tommy was in bed, Maggie stood in the kitchen and said to Eli, "I need you to be willing to testify, if it comes to that there is nothing between us, that this was a straightforward lodging arrangement. Vane can use any personal involvement to attack my credibility in court. I don't want you caught in the middle of this." He heard what she was saying. He understood why she was saying it. He also heard, underneath the careful logic of it, the thing she did not mean to be saying, which was, "I am going to do what I have always done and handle this alone so that nobody else gets hurt because of me." He said, "All right," and went outside. The next 3 days were the hardest of the month. They spoke when the work required it. They moved around each other in the house and yard like people who had remembered a distance they had let lapse and were now carefully reestablishing it. Nora was quiet, with a different quality of quiet than before. Tommy spent more time in the barn. The weather was clear and cold, and the evenings were long. On the second night, past midnight, Eli came out to check on a sound in the yard and found Maggie standing on the porch in James's coat, the one she had arrived in, looking out at the road. The snow was gone. The road was passable. She stood there for a long time. He stayed back. He watched her look at the road. Then she turned and went inside without seeing him. He stood in the cold yard and breathed. He did not know what she had decided. He was not sure she had decided anything. He was not sure he could ask. But she had gone inside, and that was something. Day 30. 5 days before Vainane's deadline, Eli was awake before 4, same as always. He was pulling on his boots by the front door when he heard the knock, not the outbuilding door. His door. He opened it. Maggie stood there in the early dark, coat on, hands in her pockets, not apologetic, not performing casualness. Just there, the way she was most things, without ceremony. He stepped back, and she came in. She sat down at the kitchen table. He put the coffee on. Neither of them spoke until he set the cups down and sat across from her. Then she said, "When I told you to deny everything, I want you to understand what I was doing. I was doing the thing I always do when I am scared. I cut things off before they can get hurt because of me. I did it with James. I stayed quiet for too long because I thought silence was protection." She looked at him directly. "It wasn't. And I don't want to do the same thing to you." Eli said, "Are you telling me this because you need my help or because you want me to stay?" She did not answer immediately. He could see her considering it, not evading, actually considering, as if it were a question she had not quite put to herself in those exact terms before. She said, "Both." He held that for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need?" She said, "I need to make the call to Denver. I need to talk to the attorney. James trusted, and I need to trust him too, because I have been carrying this alone, and I cannot carry it the way it needs to be carried alone." He said, "Make the call today." She said, "Today." He said, and Maggie was quiet. He said, "She's been holding this with you, in her own way, without knowing what she's holding. She's old enough. She deserves to know." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face changed. The careful, composed look softened slightly, not into weakness, into the kind of softness that comes after a decision. She said, "You're right." She made the call to Denver at 9 in the morning. Eli sat at the other end of the table while she dialed the number she had carried in her memory for 14 months. He did not listen to the call. He read through the printed documents and let her have the space. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. When she hung up, she sat still for a moment. Then she said, "He wants everything. All the documents, the audio file, the forensic report," he said. "If half of what's on the drive is what it sounds like, the FBI will open an investigation." She paused. He said James had contacted him 3 months before he died. He had been expecting this call. Eli said, "How long before the investigation makes the civil action against you go away?" She said, "He thinks 30 to 60 days to get the civil order suspended pending investigation. Maybe faster." Eli said, "We have 5 days. We need a second attorney here, someone local who can file a response to the civil order and buy time. I know someone in Billings, federal law. He will want to hear this." She said, "Call him." She spent the afternoon with Nora in the outbuilding. Eli did not hear what was said. He was in the barn with Tommy, who somehow always knew when his sister and mother needed time alone and found something to do elsewhere. They repaired a stall gate that had been sticking for weeks, and Tommy worked with the focus of someone giving a gift, careful and serious about getting it right. When Maggie came out of the outbuilding 2 hours later, Nora was with her. Nora's eyes were red, but she was not crying now. She had the look of someone who has been let out of a small room into open air. Nora came across the yard and stopped in front of Eli. She said, "Mom told me everything." He said, "Yeah," she said. "What do you need me to do?" He looked at her. This girl who had held a knife at his face the first day, who had threatened his barn, who had stood white-faced and terrified in front of Vane without making a sound. He said, "Right now, keep Tommy company. Later, keep being exactly who you are." She nodded, went to find her brother. That night, the four of them sat around the kitchen table for the first time as something that resembled a team. Eli and Maggie went through the documents. Nora asked intelligent questions about the chain of evidence. Tommy fell asleep on the couch behind them, one arm hanging off the edge. Ruth Elder was in the corner chair with her knitting. She had not been invited, technically. She had arrived with a pot of chili at 6 o'clock and simply stayed. She worked her needles and said nothing. And her presence had a particular quality that he had long since learned to value. The quality of someone who had enough confidence in the people around them to let them do the work themselves. Around 10, Maggie looked up from the papers and across the table at Eli. She said, "Thank you," he said. "We're not through it yet," she said. "I know, but thank you anyway." He nodded. Ruth in the corner made a small sound that could have been agreement, or possibly just her knitting. The Billings attorney's name was Gerald Foss, and he had the particular energy of a man who had spent 30 years fighting the kind of battles that most people did not know were being fought. He drove up to the ranch on a Saturday morning, read through everything over the course of 2 hours, asked precise questions, and by noon had filed a formal response to the civil order, citing the pending federal investigation, effectively pausing the 10-day requirement. Vane's deadline passed without consequence. The federal case moved slower. These things always did. But a week after the documents were transferred, Eli got a call from a contact who knew how to find out these kinds of things. Vane's business accounts had been flagged. There was movement at the federal level. The machine was turning. Maggie heard that and sat down, not from shock, from the release of something she had been bracing against for so long that the muscles had forgotten how to let go. The following week, they were clearing the outbuilding for deep winter, moving stored items, checking insulation, airing the mattresses. It was the kind of work that went fast with two people. Maggie was working the far corner under the bed frame when she pulled out a wooden box. She did not open it right away. She turned it over in her hands. Small, well-made, the wood worn smooth on the corners. A layer of dust on the lid. She brought it to the doorway, where the light was better. She carried it into the main house and found Eli at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the repair list for the winter. She set the box down in front of him. He looked at it. He did not speak for a moment. She watched something move through his face, slowly, the way a cloud moved, across a high, clear sky. It did not break anything. It just passed through. He sat back in his chair. He said, "That belonged to my son." She stayed quiet, he said. His name was Daniel. He didn't make it past 2 days old. His mother didn't make it through the delivery. He said it evenly. He had said those words before, or variations of them. He had learned to say them so that they did not break him in front of other people. Then he said, "I put that box in the outbuilding because I couldn't look at it every day. But I could not throw it out. For 9 years it sat under that bed." He looked at her. "And then Tommy came and slept in that bed every night for 6 weeks. And I heard a child's voice in that room for the first time since the day I thought I was going to hear it for the first time." Maggie said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm glad it was Tommy." He looked at her. She said, "I'm glad it was him specifically, because he would have known. Even not knowing why, he would have felt something good in that room, and it would have felt like home. Eli was quiet. He opened the box. The wooden horse was inside, carved by hand, smooth from years of someone's care. A small cowboy hat, child-sized, still in good shape. A picture book, Where the Wild Things Are, yellowed at the edges. He held the horse for a moment, then set it down carefully on the table. Maggie reached across and put her hand over his, not gripping, just resting there. He looked at her hand on his. He did not move. After a moment, he turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that at the kitchen table in the afternoon light, not saying anything, in the particular silence of two people who have arrived somewhere they did not know they were heading. After a while, he said, "I don't know what you're planning. When this is resolved, Denver. Back to Chicago, something else." "I don't know," she said. "I don't know either," he said. "I want to say something that's just the truth, without it being a pressure on you. This is the first time in 9 years that I've looked at this place and seen a future in it, instead of just the same days repeating." She looked at him. He said, "I want to build something. I don't know exactly what shape it takes, but I want it to include you and those 2 kids if you're willing, on your terms, in your time." She was still for a long moment. Then she said, "I need a little more time to know what I want. Not because I don't know the direction, because I want to choose it clearly. Not from running, not from needing somewhere to land," he said. "That's the right reason to wait." She said, "Don't propose to me. When the time comes, I want to do the asking." He almost smiled. "All right." That evening, he took the wooden box outside to the porch. He sat with it in the last light and held each item: the horse, the hat, the book. Then he went inside, into the living room, where Tommy was stretched out on the couch already falling asleep, and he set the little cowboy hat on the cushion beside the boy's head. Not on him, beside him, where he would see it when he woke. Then he went back to the porch and sat down in the dark. After a while, Maggie came out and sat in the chair beside him. The night was clear. The stars were the particular stars of high country Montana. Too many of them, impossibly bright. The kind that made the smallness of any particular human trouble feel bearable, she said. "Nora drew something for you." She left it on the counter. He went in and found it. A piece of paper folded once, pencil sketch inside. A house, a barn, 4 figures standing together in front of the door. Below it, in her handwriting, "Thank you for not asking why." He folded it carefully, tucked it into his shirt pocket, not in a drawer, not in a box. In his pocket, where a person put things they planned to carry with them. 6 months later, on a Thursday in April, Eli put a piece of paper on the kitchen table. Maggie came in from outside, pulling off her gloves, and looked at it. She picked it up and read it through once. Then again. Then she sat down. It was a ranch partnership agreement. 2 names on the property title, his and hers. He said, "This isn't a proposal. This is me saying I want to build this with you. The rest we figure out as we go." She read it a 3rd time. Then she reached for the pen he had left beside it. She signed it. Then she set the pen down and said, "When we're ready for the rest of it, I'm doing the asking. That's my only condition." He said, "I know." She looked at him. He smiled. She had seen him smile before, small and careful, the kind of smile that had limits on it. This one did not have limits on it. It started in his eyes and reached all the way to the corners of his mouth, and it was the smile of a man who has been given something back that he had stopped believing would come back. She laughed, briefly, quietly, the way a person laughs when they are surprised by something good. Vane's situation had moved slowly, which was how federal cases moved. But it had moved. His business accounts had been frozen pending investigation. Two of his associates had taken early plea agreements and named him in connection with the financial fraud. The charge related to James Callahan's death was harder to prove, and Gerald Foss said it would take time, but the audio file had been admitted as preliminary evidence. Maggie was a protected witness with a full legal team and a case record. She was no longer the woman in the sealed wagon. She was the woman with the documentation, the forensic report signed with her name, and the attorney who had been waiting 14 months for this call. Nora was enrolled in online coursework, building toward the college application she had delayed a year. She had written her admissions essay. She let Maggie read it once. It was about learning to trust a stranger when you have no options left. She wrote about it the way she did everything, directly, without softening it, letting the truth carry the weight. Tommy named his young horse Second Chance. Nobody suggested the name. He just arrived at the barn one morning and announced that was the horse's name. And that was that. Maggie had begun work at the Billings Hospital on a part-time basis. The forensic background she had let go of 18 years ago had come back to her the way things came back when they had never really left. She was building something there, carefully, in her own time. The autumn Thanksgiving was Ruth Elder's idea, technically. She had suggested it to Tommy, who had suggested it to everyone else with such absolute conviction that it became a plan before anyone had agreed to it. The table was full. Ruth and Tommy were in a deep disagreement about pie. Ruth held that pumpkin pie required fresh grated nutmeg, and that this was not a preference but a fact. Tommy held that both pumpkin and apple pie were equally good, and that the argument was unnecessary. Neither was giving ground. Nora was home from her first semester of college, and she had brought her roommate, a young woman named Clara from New Mexico, who was learning, as the afternoon progressed, that Montana hospitality moved at its own pace and could not be hurried. Two neighbors from the farm to the east had come, a young couple who had bought the land in the spring and were in the early stages of learning what high country winters required. Eli was explaining his theory of fire management in a wood stove, which the young husband was listening to, with the focused attention of someone who had already made several expensive mistakes. Maggie was at the stove with Ruth, who had temporarily abandoned the pie argument to supervise the gravy. The kitchen smelled like everything a kitchen should smell like on a November afternoon, like bread and meat and wood smoke and the specific warmth of a house that is full. Tommy appeared at Eli's elbow and tugged on his sleeve. He had the expression he got when something was serious. He said, "Can I talk to you for a second?" Eli excused himself from the fire management discussion and followed Tommy into the hallway. Tommy looked up at him with the full gravity of a boy who had thought about this for some time. He said, "Are you my dad?" Eli was quiet for a moment. He looked across the room to the kitchen, where Maggie was standing at the stove with her back turned. As if she felt it, she half-turned, and their eyes met for just a second. She gave the smallest nod. Eli crouched down to Tommy's level. He said, "I'm the man who loves your mother and wants to be here for you. What you call me is up to you. I don't need a title to know what I am." Tommy considered this with enormous seriousness. Then he said, "I'll keep calling you Eli, but I mean Dad." Eli put his hand on the boy's shoulder. The same gesture, the hand placed down, without gripping, without ceremony, the quiet language he seemed to have found for the things that mattered most. He said, "I know. I mean it too." Tommy nodded, satisfied, and went back to the pie argument. Eli stayed in the hallway for a moment, then he went back to the room. Later, while everyone moved to the porch to watch the sun go down behind the ridge, Nora stood at the sink with Maggie, drying dishes. She said, without any particular build-up, "You look different," Maggie said. "Different how?" Nora said, "Like you're home." Not a compliment, just an observation, the kind that land exactly right because there is no performance in them. Maggie set down the cup she was drying. She stood at the sink for a moment, with her hands still and the evening light coming through the window. She said, "Yeah, I think I am." On the porch, the sky was doing what Montana skies did in November at sunset, turning colors that had no names for them in the standard vocabulary, red deepening to orange, purple pressing in from the east. The whole thing stretched from one end of the horizon to the other without apology or restraint. Ruth settled into the chair beside Eli with the particular deliberateness of a woman who had chosen her spot. She said, "You know what the bravest thing you ever did was," Eli said, opening that canvas. She shook her head. She said, "Not running after you opened it." He looked at the sky. He thought about that morning in October, the frozen track, the wrong silence inside the canvas, the choice between the easy thing and the right thing. He thought about 9 years of choosing the easy thing and how a man could go that long in that direction before something stopped him on a frozen road and reminded him that the right thing was still available. He said, "I didn't know what I was opening." Ruth said, "You never do. That's the whole point." The door opened behind them, and Maggie came out. She stood beside Eli and looked at the sky. After a moment, her hand found his. They stood like that, watching the colors change, while behind them the voices of everyone they had gathered came through the warm light of the open door. Inside, in a wooden box on the shelf in the front room, a carved horse and a small cowboy hat sat in the company of a picture book. The dust was gone from the lid. The box was open. That was new. Some things take a long time to open. Some things have to wait for the right hands. But they wait. She had believed, in the sealed wagon on that October morning, that she was running away. She had been wrong about that. She had been running towards something the whole time. She just hadn't known what was waiting. Maybe that is the thing that desperation sometimes does, when it is desperate enough. Not destroy a person, not break them all the way down, but carry them without asking permission, without announcing itself to exactly the place they needed to be, at exactly the moment they were finally ready to stay. The sun went behind the ridge. The sky held its colors for a long moment. Then, slowly, gently, it let them go. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
Before we close, I want to take a moment to talk about what this story is really saying. Because on the surface, this is a story about a cowboy who finds a woman in a broken-down wagon on a frozen Montana morning. But underneath that, it is about something much closer to home for all of us. This is a story about the walls we build. Eli Rourke spent 9 years becoming an expert at not needing anyone. He fed his animals, he fixed his fences, he kept his house in order. And from the outside, that looked like strength. But the wooden box under the bed in the empty outbuilding told the truth. You do not hide something in the dark for 9 years because you are at peace with it. You hide it because you cannot yet find the courage to hold it in the light. Maggie Callahan built a different kind of wall.
Hers was made of motion. She kept moving so she would not have to stop and feel the full weight of what she had lost, and what she had allowed, and what she wished she had done sooner. Running looked like survival, and for a while it was. But survival and living are not the same thing. She knew that. She just needed somewhere safe enough to stop pretending otherwise. Here's the lesson this story carries, and it is one worth sitting with. The people who need us most will not always arrive the way we expect. They will not knock politely at the front door. Sometimes they arrive in a broken wagon, feverish and afraid, with a teenage girl holding a knife and a little boy clutching an empty canteen. And in that moment, the question life is asking us is not whether we are ready, it is whether we are willing. Eli was not ready. He had not been ready for 9 years. But he was willing. And that willingness, that single choice to open the canvas instead of riding past, changed everything. Not because it was heroic, because it was human. This story also asks us to think about the people around us whose strength we have never acknowledged because it was the quiet kind. The mothers who hold everything together without being asked. The children who understand more than we tell them. The neighbors who show up with a pot of chili and stay without explanation. These people are not background characters in someone else's story. They are the story. Choose to open the canvas. Choose to stay after you open it. Choose to be the person who does not ride past. That is what the West has always taught, and it is still true today.